All right, hello everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Um, my name is Jason Roberts. My history as a developer is the story of exactly one game called Gorogoa. So this talk will focus on that game and some wisdom that I hope I've extracted from the process of making it. Talk is called The Elegance of Awkward Design, and I'll get into what I mean about awkwardness and why it can be, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I always feel a little bit strange about giving advice or pretending to dispense wisdom. Again, I've only made one game, and the game I made was very weird and idiosyncratic, and so it's always hard to say what lessons other people can learn from the process that I went through. I like to listen to a podcast about screenwriting. It's called Script Notes, partly because hearing about the challenges of being a screenwriter makes me feel better about the challenges of being a game developer. And one thing the hosts of that show always say when people ask them, how do I break into the business of writing movies, is they say that everyone who succeeds does so by creating a new path where there was no path before, and after they take that path, it ceases to exist. Again, that's a statement about screenwriting. Is it also true of games? Well, I think it's less true in games, but I think it becomes more true the smaller your team is, and it's especially true for individuals with very limited resources. And so, sure enough, I'm not going to tell you to follow the path that I took, and that's not just because everyone should be out there forging their own path. It's because, for me, the experience of making the game felt like I was never on a path at all. I feel like the idea of a path is the wrong metaphor, at least in my case. I spent the entire time kind of stumbling through undergrowth. And if that sounds discouraging, I'll try and present it as a more inspirational metaphor. I'm sure we've all had the experience where we're out hiking or we're exploring a landscape and we see a place that you want to get to, let's say a rocky outcropping. There's no obvious way to get there, so you start to force your way through the bushes, and the bushes are thicker and scratchier than you expected. Your clothes keep getting tangled, you keep twisting your ankle. Maybe you have to clamber over some crumbling rocks, and you keep slipping and scratching yourself, skinning your knees. And when you get up there, you're all banged up. The process of getting to the top is not just difficult, it's undignified, it's messy. And that's not just because you missed the elegant way to the top, it's because there was no elegant way. You have to sacrificing your dignity and grace was the price of getting up there. And the best part is that if some other hikers come along and they see you up there, because you look so clever perched up on top of that rock, they'll assume that you found a clever way up there. This is what I like to call the presumption of elegance. If you've achieved an elegant outcome, people will assume you had an elegant process. And because they can't see the elegant process, they can't see the path, it seems more magical. This is the central metaphor. But let's go back to the early history of making Gorogoa. It was my first game, as I said. When I started out, I didn't know anything, and I didn't realize I was supposed to know anything. So classic, naive arrogance. I hadn't gone to any talks like this. I hadn't watched any videos or read any books. And that had a high cost. The game took over 5 years to make, and that's partly because I had to learn a lot of design lessons the hard way. And I made a lot of decisions about how to approach making the game early on that would, be irreversible. It was too late to change them, and they would make my life a lot harder. And that's sort of what I mean by awkwardness. As I got farther into the project, and I did absorb some wisdom from outside, I began to realize that the way my process was going didn't match the more elegant, orderly process that other developers were advocating, at least from the stage at talks like this. I had a really labor-intensive art style. It's all pencil art, and when I made animations, at least early on, every animation frame was individually hand rotoscoped. Iteration was very slow to try out different puzzle ideas, partly because of the art and partly for other reasons which I'll get into. It didn't feel like there was really momentum or flow in the design. That is to say that solving one problem, designing one puzzle, didn't necessarily make the next puzzle any easier. There wasn't a point where everything clicked and just started rolling. The structure of the whole game felt brittle and chaotic, by which I mean that a small change to something can break something else. Solving one problem has a tendency to unsolve things that were supposed to be solved already, and little changes create big ripples. And finally, it felt like all the domains of design, which should be separate, like puzzle design, level design, visual design, were all tangled up and overlapped in a way that they couldn't be separated. And this was, again, contrasted in my mind with what I thought was the proper process, and is the proper process, ideally, where you have efficient pipeline to produce assets, or as efficient as possible, fast iteration. I don't think I need to explain why that's a good thing. You gain momentum, your mechanic starts to speak to you and then starts to organically generate gameplay moments on its own. You have a flexible modular structure so that, again, one change doesn't break something in a completely different part of the game. And you have a nice tidy separation of domains so you can delegate work to different members of a team or schedule things intelligently. So I had some moments of crisis where it didn't seem like I was doing it the right way, and it didn't feel like I had found a path exactly. I was just forcing my way forward, and every step was kind of a struggle. And I had to reach a point in the design, in thinking about the design, where I had to figure out a reason why that awkwardness was essential. And that was a core part of what made the game what it was. And to return to this landscape metaphor, it wasn't that I needed to feel like the awkwardness was coming from the terrain that I was entering, not from my process, not from my means of moving through the terrain, but from the terrain itself. So it was the unavoidable price I was paying for exploring a new and strange corner of the landscape. And I want to give some examples of what I mean, go fairly deep and get into some concrete details, since I think that's always what's most useful. And I'm assuming that you've played the game. It's been out since December, so you've had plenty of time. And but just as a refresher, the game boils down mostly to two basic mechanics where you're combining pictures together, either by connecting the pictures along one edge, as you see on the left, or by stacking pictures that have holes in them on top of each other to form a new image. And I'm going to concentrate on the left-hand side, where we're connecting images laterally, joining them along an edge, because that was by far the hardest thing to design. So here are two tiles joined together vertically. You can see that in between them is a horizontal seam, and that all the colors have to align across the seam. Pixel by pixel, ideally, the two edges of these two images should be exactly the same, which can be a very exacting and precise requirement. It's like having a 640-pin connector. And each of these connected scenes is actually just a zoomed portion of a larger scene. So it's not just a picture connecting mechanic, it's a zoom and connect mechanic. And if you look at the larger scenes, ideally they should look ordinary and innocuous. But hidden inside these scenes are these seams where two images connect, where all the pixels in one image have to align with the corresponding pixels in the other image. So that means that these two scenes visually are linked. The visual decisions made in one image leak or kind of reach through this seam, like tentacles reaching through a dimensional rift into the other scene. And so the visual designs of these different spaces becomes very entangled in a very unusual way, especially because in several scenes of the game there are multiple of these seams where one image connects to multiple other images. So just the nature of the mechanic makes this complicated and entangled and awkward. And there were certain decisions I made to try and impose discipline on myself that made things even more challenging. For example, let's say I want to join these two scenes together. One is a desert, one is a forest. They have different colors, different shapes. It's not easy to see where I should put the seam. And early on, the kind of strategy that I tried adopting is I do something like putting a statue in the foreground of both of these scenes, and then the seam that's going to connect them together just runs down the center of the statue. So they connect together like this. And this approach has certain advantages. Again, the constraints, the seam is a place where the design decisions made in one scene leak into and interfere with the other scene, but using this statue as a kind of bridge object, that means that the constraints are limited to the statue. The infection is kind of contained. And the rest of each scene can be just designed independently. So there's a degree of modularity in this approach. But I just don't like the way this looks. It feels wrong. It doesn't feel like a single image. It feels like two images spliced together, kind of like people Photoshop two incongruous images into one image in a way that is sort of headache-inducingly surreal. I mean, the image is is visually continuous in terms of pixels, but it's not logically continuous. It feels like two things grafted together. And so I decided that that kind of approach would not be acceptable, that when two tiles fit together, they have to form a new continuous composition. Here's the example from the beginning again, and you can see that I also like to have these very strong shapes that run perpendicular to the seam, connecting the two images. And I sort of think of that as like, rebar that structurally connects these two images and is much sturdier than the patch job you were looking at earlier. But again, because these images have to connect sort of holistically, that just increases the extent to which scenes are, leak into each other and entangle with each other in these complex ways. That decision, that mechanic might not have been as big a problem as it was, however, if it weren't for the game's visual style. Approaching the game as an artist, there are certain things I wanted to do visually, just because that's the style I like to work in. I like a lot of dense detail and variety in shapes and textures, and I wanted to do reasonably sophisticated lighting. I mean, not that sophisticated, but I wanted lighting at least to be varied and be able to depict different types of day, different lighting environments. And just considering lighting by itself, that turned out to be a huge issue in this whole problem of making scenes fit together. Like in this scene, you have on one side we have a room lit by daylight or electrical light. The other room is dark. And you can see that I try and solve this problem by putting a fireplace in one room to try and match the lighting of the other room. But that sort of thing takes a huge amount of fussing because firelight and daylight or electrical light, they work differently. They illuminate things differently, they cast shadows differently, and so I would just have to sort of, tweak the depiction of fire just enough and tweak the lighting on the left-hand scene just enough so that I can make them fit together. And again, solving one of these problems doesn't necessarily help me solve the next one. I also have cases where, like on the left-hand side here, I have a scene that's outside in daylight, and the right-hand side is a map. It's just a diagram. It has no lighting at all. And I've got to figure out how to make these two scenes marry together. And again, it has to do with how much I can tweak the look of the map so that it doesn't lose, so it still looks sort of plausibly like an abstract diagram, and how much can I play with the architecture and lighting on the left to make these fit together. And again, we have this interior with lamplight and an exterior at a completely different scale of a building at sunset. And it's never a given that if I arrive at the situation of wanting to connect two scenes like this, and assuming the lighting in both of these scenes is dictated by other puzzles in the game, so I can't easily change them, it's never a given that I can actually pull any of these puzzles off and make them work. And as I said, I also like density and variety. I like a lot of stuff going on in shapes and textures. That means that there's a lot of dense detail crossing the seam when two images join. In fact, that's what I think makes it more interesting when they do join. And designing each one of these seams is not only is each instance of connection a separate problem, but when you have a scene like this with multiple objects crossing the seam, each of those objects is a separate problem. The top scene is small objects on a shelf, and the bottom scene is the outside of a building. So I have to, on the left-hand side of the shelf, there's a package that's wrapped in string, and that connects to scaffolding on the building. There's a box that has ropes wrapped around it, and the ropes have a braided structure. And then on the front of the building, you have these columns that are spiral columns, and it all just happens to work. I mean, I wish I could reveal the secret for designing stuff like this, but the revelation is there isn't a secret. You just sit around musing about every object in existence until you find two that are similar in form, that might exist at two different scales, and you try and make it work. But the problem is, as I say, that the prospect of making any of these pictures connect, it never feels like a given. Each one is like a big leap, design-wise. And that's a problem because I can come up with a puzzle that connects two images, but I can't prove to myself that it can even be built, much less solved, until I do a fair amount of work putting it together. I can't do sort of gray box designs for this picture connecting mechanic because it depends in a very kind of fragile way, in a very specific way on small details of the scene. And a part of the design has failed if any part of a scene just looks wrong, or if like the front of a building looks ugly or improbable. Those are very touchy-feely constraints. And so what happens is I had to, in the end, when I was at my smartest, I would finish art in the game to about the 75% point before I could be confident that a puzzle is going to work, a connection is going to work visually at all. And of course, that means that iteration was extremely slow. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons. And it's the reason why there are relatively few puzzles in the game. There's, you can imagine a version of Gorogoa that is, is much longer and has many more puzzles and was a lot faster to make. And I think it would look something like this, where, this is not meant to be pejorative, but you can imagine a design where you use sort of consistent geometric shapes, you use consistent colors and textures, the lighting is always from the same angle, you're always looking at structures at the same depth from the same distance, and that means you can systematize the way tiles connect. You can come up with a finite set of solutions for how two things can plug together that allow you to have confidence that if you're designing part of a level, you can fit two things together relatively easily. You can design a puzzle with minimal graphics because you're going to be able to replace those with functional art. And that doesn't have to look that game doesn't have to look as primitive as this does. It could look pretty nice. And I think, as I say, I think that sort of parallel universe version of the game would have a lot more puzzles, and it would be able, and mechanically it could explore the possibilities of connecting and dividing images much more deeply and thoroughly, and it would have taken less time to make. This is what I believe. So obviously this is not an inferior concept to the game I made. It has lots of advantages. But I think that, my feeling is that if you play a game like this, at least this is what happens to me, all the art that I'm looking at, the longer you play, in your mind slowly disappears and it's replaced with a schematic. You develop this, it's like seeing the Matrix. You see shapes for their functional properties and how they're going to connect. Especially because in a design like this, you might be very careful to kind of train the player using a consistent visual language, like saying, a red roof, horizontal red roof always means that two things are going to connect. So even players that aren't experienced designers, you're training them to, mentally disassemble the design and see it schematically. All the tools that you as a designer use to make it easier for you to put the game together allow the player to mentally take it apart. So they can see what you did. They can see the joints and seams in your work, which isn't necessarily, it's not an inherently bad thing. If you're making a mechanically focused game, then that you kind of want the player to see through to the schematic space because that's where the actual gameplay lies. But I had clearly, from the very beginning, set off on a different course, and I needed to figure out what it was that I value and why it was worth giving up all these beautiful and mechanically intricate puzzles. And my answer, which sort of began instinctively, is that I want the game to feel like an interactive magic trick more than anything else. And in a magic trick, you shouldn't be able to see how it works. You shouldn't see what the parts are or how they fit together. That schematic should not be visible. The quantities I was trying to maximize, I eventually realized, are surprise and mystery and delight. And those surprise, mystery, and delight thrive on the improbable and on the transcendence of apparent contradiction. And one way to achieve that sense of improbability is to wade into this awkward design territory that the player can sense is awkward. And that makes, everything I do to make, every decision I made that made it harder for myself to design the game, made it harder to make two pictures connect together, makes it seem less probable, makes it seem more remarkable and less probable when they do fit together. The user sort of like looks at a scene, and because they can't see any seams, their eye can't find the gameplay machinery in a scene. So they realize the challenges that would be involved in making these two things fit together, and therefore they discount that possibility. They discount the possibility that anyone would design a game this inefficiently, and that's the core of my magic trick. At least that's what I eventually decided. And I always wanted the game to leave a kind of mental after image in the mind, so that when you play the game, it changes the way you see the real world around you briefly. And the game is all about sort of these deeply hidden secrets in the world and this hidden potential, and that there are all these fragments of meaning hidden that if you could just find the right way to connect them would lead you to something greater. And that only, that fantasy is only transferable to the real world if, as I say, the seams are hidden. Because you look at the real world, it doesn't look like a game. It looks like, at first glance, like a jumble of objects that have no, cosmic purpose. So the very difficulty and awkwardness of making this mechanic work are precisely why it feels magical. And it's a conscious trade-off, or an eventually conscious trade-off, between mechanical breadth and depth and this sort of one core idea of creating surprise and wonder. Moving on from visual design, let's look at another early fateful decision I made. This one is about interaction, how the player interacts with the world. Because Gorogoa, a lot of its DNA comes from old point-and-click adventure games. Very early conceptions of the game had adventure game-like controls, sort of Myst-like controls, in that you could click on objects, you could push buttons or open doors or turn levers. That was just the most natural way to build the interface. So, for example, in this scene, this door could be locked with a combination lock. And maybe there's a puzzle where you have to find a nearby graveyard and find a specific grave, and you get the date, off that headstone, and that's the combination. Not the most inspired puzzle, maybe, but it's a bread and butter adventure game puzzle. And the nice thing is that as a designer, that gives me a little bit of breathing room, allows me to pad out the game, because after all, this picture connecting business is really difficult to execute, and it's not yielding a ton of content. So if I can, interleave that with more conventional puzzles that might, that are relatively, that combination lock puzzle is relatively inexpensive asset-wise, and might, could still be challenging or interesting. However, I decided that I was going to completely take away the player's ability to touch or interact with the world. And I did that, ironically, it's one thing that seemed like a very grown-up, very elegant and crisp design decision that I made, because I wanted to focus on the core mechanic, which is connecting pictures, and that should be the only way to advance in the game. And if I gave myself this sort of safety net of being able to build combination lock puzzles, then I would be tempted to abuse that, and as I said, pad the game out with less interesting, more conventional puzzles. And although, that makes sense, from a design standpoint, I didn't realize until I got into the thick of making the game how big a problem, how big a challenge that design decision was going to be. This is a very simple, proto-puzzle where the player turns a crank to raise a bucket from one tile into another after connecting them together. But even this simple puzzle I can't build because the player can't turn cranks. They can't touch anything or have any physical influence on the world. So I think, okay, I'll put a counterweight. The counterweight system in the top tile is stable until you connect the two tiles. And then once they're connected, that creates a new physical system. The weight lowers, the bucket rises, and that's wonderful. The player can't input energy into the world, so I have to build potential energy in the form of this hanging counterweight. But the problem is that this lowering of the weight, rising of the bucket, that's like a one-time, one-way state transition. And it happens as soon as you connect two tiles together, which means that the player is going to be, for one thing, prone to solve this puzzle by accident. Because the world is self-driving, when you connect up the parts of the system, things just suddenly move, and you may not even have realized what you did until it's already over. And that was a huge problem with the design from the very start, is this whole issue of people accidentally solving problems. And that is mostly down to this one design decision I made to eliminate physical interaction. Because if you have to turn the crank to raise the bucket, first of all, that adds at least one extra step to solving the puzzle. Even this very simple puzzle, like you connect the tiles to link up the bucket rope, and then it takes one extra step where you turn the crank to raise the rope. And it also means that with access to that crank, the player can raise and lower the bucket, and that's the doorway into a much larger state space for the puzzle, which is what puzzles need to be complex. And there might have been some interesting non-physical puzzles that designs I was leaving on the table. Like, let's say the combination lock puzzle where you get the combo from a graveyard. Let's say the graveyard and the door are in two separate tiles. You could argue that this is a different and philosophically interesting way for two tiles to connect within the game. They're connecting informationally. You're taking information from one scene and using it in another, and so that could just be a whole other axis of connection in the game, which could be very compelling. The problem is how do I implement a combination lock? A lock needs enough degrees of freedom that the player can demonstrate that they've learned something. If you think about the way the mechanics of the game work, connecting and stacking images, how do I make a lock with 3 dials that you can turn? Every degree of freedom that I offer the player in a system like that is extremely expensive. And as it happens, there is sort of a combination lock in the game. It's this clock tower. You have to set the hands to the right time, and then something happens. Not literally a lock, but it has 2 dials that you set to do different numbers. So how does the player turn the dials on the clock? Well, they have to turn the 2 hands separately. One hand is part of a pressure gauge. You have to connect 2 tiles together to heat up a vessel, raise the pressure so that the pressure gauge needle moves. The other uses a compass needle. You have to figure out that the compass needle tracks this pole star, and then use the relative positions of the tiles to direct the needle. It's very involved. It's one of the more complex sequences in the game. And because it's so hard to enter the combination, I just give it to the player up front. I tell them where the time the clock has to be set to at the very beginning of the sequence, because if they had to find the combination and enter the combination, it would just be too bewildering. So this constraint I've put on myself has kind of turned everything on its head. The basic mechanical tasks are extremely difficult to include in the game. So, of course, I wondered whether it was a mistake, and it wouldn't have been too difficult. And this wasn't as irreversible as other decisions, because I can add touching, add the ability to push buttons. And if it wasn't a mistake, I needed to understand why it was a valuable decision. Well, first of all, by taking a very obvious expected ability away from the player, the ability to touch and physically interact with the world, I'm putting them into a very strange and unexpected relationship to the game world and forcing them to think in new and very different ways. And that is exciting in and of itself. That limitation can be stimulating for the player. And by placing the same constraint on myself as the designer, that the player can't touch anything, I create a player that's sort of disembodied. Because they're not physically touching anything, it's not clear who or what they are in the game world, or whether they have a body. And having built a game like that opened doors in my mind that created a lot more freedom in terms of how the player could interact with the world. Like there's no constraints of moving through space, for example, because as a designer I wasn't thinking of the player as having a body, anything that's visible in the distance you can just move to, and I don't have to explain how that movement is possible. Even more so, you can enter a character's thoughts or memories, and the physics or the magic of that doesn't have to be explained, because I haven't established a literal metaphor of the character's physicality that this would violate. And the ability to move into images and pictures and memories was essential for for stringing together scenes in the game, because in the game you move continuously from one place to another. And so how do I sort of put the equivalent of a cut from one moment in time to a different moment in time? Well, I can do it by jumping into a player's memory or into a photo on the wall. So I actually had the disembodiment of the player created this freedom in terms of how I could string scenes together. And I can do things like this where, you can fly inside a China pattern, or you can enter pictures. And that sort of ambiguous, ghostly relationship between the player and the world also had higher level sort of thematic implications for me. Because the player isn't physically, or is ambiguously physically present in each of these scenes, then it becomes possible to sort of think of the whole game as being as not a physical process, but a mental process. And you can think of the scenes in the game as fragments of memory, and the process of playing the game as shuffling those fragments around. And just like you can't go in and touch and physically change your memories, you can't touch or change the scenes in this world. So that was a sort of thematic implication or possibility that grew out of this decision to take something fundamental away from the player. So again, I feel like the very act of imposing this very strange and awkward restriction on myself and the player was my way of entering this sort of alien landscape, this very lumpy, thorny part of the design landscape, but that's where that was also an unexplored part of that landscape, and that's precisely what made it feel strange and mysterious. And by giving a talk in defense of awkwardness, I'm not suggesting that you should cultivate awkwardness as an end in itself. I'm not suggesting that you should walk around with your shoelaces tied together. I would put it like this. The moral, for me, at least, is not that you should proceed awkwardly over open terrain, but that as a designer, you should explore inherently awkward terrain and not see the resistance of moving through that, that difficult space as a sign that you're going in the wrong direction. But rule 3 is to have the wisdom to know the difference. Is what you're working on, is the going difficult because you're going the wrong way, or is it because you're going to an interesting but inaccessible place? And I honestly, with the experience of just one game behind me, I'm not sure I can tell you reliably how to tell that difference. That part's up to you. But if you do, reach this rocky, thorny corner of the design landscape, and you get in there, then there are some automatic advantages that you have simply by virtue of that, the difficulty of accessing that space in and of itself. First of all, if the design was difficult to execute, if you're in a place that was difficult to get to, it's more likely you were the first person there, that you've done something new. And by the same token, once you get there, people are less likely to follow you, to compete with you, to clone you, etc. And third is, again, what I call the presumption of elegance. Doing something in a sort of awkward, achieving something through an awkward and ugly process, as I say, makes it seem more magical because people never expect that something elegant was achieved inelegantly. And because they can't see the elegant solution, and they will never consider the awkward solution, it becomes magic. Lastly, I should say that again, I think the advice I'm giving is most applicable to small teams and individuals like myself. I did all the design and all the art myself, and this was a way for me to have a particular advantage that larger teams might not. To kind of extend the landscape metaphor, the world of possible game designs is this alien landscape that we're all exploring together. And when you're trying to build something in a wilderness, if you're trying to build something big and substantial, the first thing you need to do is make roads. Not just paths, but roads. And then you bring in equipment, use the roads to bring in equipment that allows you to build larger things. And in the case of game development, what I mean by roads are things like your engines, your authoring tools, your systems to manage production workflow and scheduling, everything you need in a larger project to make it work even before you've created any content. And that make it possible to do big and important things, or big and impressive things. And again, there will always be corners of that metaphorical design landscape where you can't build roads. And that means that people who are individuals who can scramble over rocks will be able to go where larger teams can't go or can't follow. That's, at least for me, that's been the moral of the process for me. It's like being a little rodent that can squeeze between rocks to escape from dinosaurs. And I guess that metaphor is insulting to small and large teams. So I'll stop there. Again, my name is Jason Roberts. Here's some info. Again, I just made just one game, so that's the extent of my wisdom.
Thank you so much, Jason. Does anyone have any question for Jason? A lot of interesting design ideas. So, any designers that have any questions? Well, actually, I have one.
Okay.
If you could look into the future, will have you repeated the same process all over again?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's the point. That's the realization I had to come to, is why I would do it again. And I mean, there are some things I got better at making the game. Especially, I got a little bit smarter about how and when to make art. But again, I think the most difficult decisions that I made were essential to what the game ended up being, and that set it apart from other games, and that sort of being noticeable or remarkable is more important than ever in terms of getting people's attention or getting people to talk about something. So a more sort of efficiently created game might have been just as good, but less unusual, less remarkable. So word of mouth wouldn't have fired the same way, I guess.
Now that you've gone through this difficult process and you managed to, defeat this problem, so to speak, are you thinking on working on another game using this elegant awkwardness, or are you planning to go on something a bit easier or a bit more palpable now that the hard part being noticed is done? Well,
one of the first things I thought about when considering the next game is to design something where art and the mechanics are decoupled, so the pictures don't have to directly meld together with each other. They, things connect or relate in a different way, and then I can potentially postpone figuring out the art style or work with a different artist. So that's one, awkward design decision I made on this game that I plan to reverse in the next game and do it the more conventional way. I may still do the art myself, but I don't want to be dependent on that. However, the kind of ideas I will consider will always be really awkward, difficult design problems in other ways. So yeah, I believe in kind of forging into that kind of thorny thicket of things that is areas that don't immediately yield a lot of design fruit right away, but take work.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you for your talk. I know you worked with Edu Ortiz on the sound.
Eduardo, yeah.
Yeah, Eduardo. And I wanted to ask, who else did you work with on this project, and how did you convince them to go on this journey with you to this insane mountain?
So it was me, it was Eduardo who did sound design, and Joel Korlitz, who was the composer. There was also a port engineer that did the Unity port, Matt Whiting, and Joel came on the project relatively far in because there's certain things that, I don't know, I'm sure this is composers will dispute how early they should come on a project, but there are certain things they wanted to figure out narratively before I knew what music would feel right. As far as Eduardo, he was on pretty early and was very patient. And the way sound works in the game was its own challenge because I wanted the spaces that inside the tiles to feel sort of contradictorily physical and have soundscapes as though they were real spaces. But then the question becomes, what do you do when you have multiple scenes on screen at the same time? Do you play all of the ambient sound at once? Do you kind of refocus the sound as you move the mouse around? Or do you play only one soundscape at a time? But in that case, how do you decide which soundscape is playing? And that was the thorny problem that Eduardo and I went back and forth on for a long time. So that was was his part of the awkward process. I don't know. I mean, I hope it wasn't. He had to hang on through a very, very slow project, and I appreciate that. But you know, he loved the game from early on, or at least convincingly said so, and he, you know, sort of loved it in just for the overall feel of it, and the spaces and the sort of dreamlike quality of the game. So he was very, as a player, he was very forgiving of the mechanics and everything else in the game. So he made a flexible design partner in that sense, and did amazing work, as did Joel.
Any other question? Yeah, here.
Thank you for the talk. And I was curious about the art inspirations for the project, for the art side in general, even if it's architecture.
Yeah, I mean, so there's the sort of rendering style, and then there's the design of architecture. A lot of the architectural inspiration came from parts of Spain, actually, like the Alhambra and Sevilla, and lots of structures that, you know, combined the sort of the intersection between the Christian and Islamic traditions. That stuff was really compelling for me, and had a sort of intercultural quality that I wanted in sort of creating a world that was similar to ours, but different. And some of the more visual designers, like I was influenced, and the biggest influence was this illustrator and puzzle designer named Christopher Manson, who made a book called Maze, which is a puzzle book. And but there's the illustrator like Gustave Doré, who traveled around and traveled to a lot of these same places I'm describing, and did illustrations of architecture. And this 19th century traveler and illustrator named David Roberts, who did drawings of, in the Middle East and in Egypt, of these ruined structures. That was a big visual influence. Edward Gorey, and there's countless things sort of fed into my visual style. But also, I only, in terms of how I draw things, I only know one way to draw. I'm not skilled enough to vary my style, so when I draw things, it just always comes out one way. And a lot of the influences are probably unconscious.
Any other question? I have another one.
Okay.
So, are there any advices you could give to indies that want to start a very creative and innovative process in terms of sustainability and funding, and how did you manage all those 5 years?
Yeah, I can't advise you to. I mean, the process I took in making the game was very risky, and it partly succeeded because I had a high-paying job beforehand, and I did not intend to spend all of my savings making the game, but that's what I did, and that was like 60% of the way through the project. Lost my mic? No, there it is. So I guess, and that's the challenge of giving a talk like this, is that I don't want to encourage people to, from a financial standpoint, to take the approach I took, because it very easily could have ended in disaster. I mean, I didn't sit down and plan to spend 5 years making a game, but that can happen on a project depending on how it works. So there's, and the reason I was able to get over the finish line had to do with finding a good a publisher, Annapurna, that I could work with, I don't know how easy that is if you're starting out with just a pitch to, I brought them a game I'd already put a ton of work into. I guess from a design standpoint, I would say that, mix the wisdom I'm trying to give you about exploring awkward design space with a little bit more sense than I had, if that makes sense. Like you try and figure out which parts of the design are willing, are worth investing that extra energy and sort of discomfort in, and then make everything else as efficient as possible.
Any other question for Jason? Yes? Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
So Rami is finishing an interview. He'll be here right away. So.